My name is Maya Chen, and for 8 months I was somewhere between living and dying. When I finally opened my eyes, the first thing I noticed wasn't the hospital room or the machines or even the sunlight filtering through the blinds. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that comes from abandonment. The kind that settles into your bones when you realize that in your darkest hour, the people who were supposed to love you simply chose not to show up. My phone had exactly 3 missed calls. 2 from my landlord about unpaid rent, and 1 from a debt collector. 0 from my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The nurse who helped me sit up that first morning, Caroline, had kind eyes but a careful way of speaking, like she'd rehearsed bad news before. She adjusted my pillow and asked if I wanted her to call anyone. I gave her my mother's number. She dialed it, held the phone to my ear, and I listened to it ring 4 times before going to voicemail. Caroline tried my brother next. Same result. She didn't say anything, just squeezed my shoulder gently and told me to rest. But I couldn't rest. Because in that moment, lying in a hospital bed with muscles I had to relearn how to use, I understood something I'd spent my whole life trying to deny. I had never mattered to them. Not really. And maybe I never would. 3 years later, I stood in the hallway outside Courtroom 5 at the Multnomah County Courthouse, smoothing down the front of my charcoal gray suit. My hands didn't shake anymore. Not like they used to during those first months of physical therapy when I couldn't even hold a pen. Now they were steady. Certain. I'd worked too hard to get here to let anything rattle me now. My briefcase sat on the bench beside me, stuffed with depositions, environmental impact reports, and testimonies from families whose lives had been upended by corporate greed. This wasn't just another case. This was the case. The one that would set precedent. The one that had taken 2 years to build. And the defendants, the ones who tried every legal maneuver to avoid this day, were about to walk through those doors and sit across from me. They just didn't know yet that the lead attorney for the plaintiffs was someone they'd left to rot in a hospital bed. Someone they'd written off as too broken to ever come back. My brother Derek. His wife Vanessa. My mother Linda. They were all named in the lawsuit, accessories to the environmental violations committed by Chen Development Group, the real estate empire my brother had built with family money and zero accountability. When they'd ignored my existence for 8 months, they probably thought I'd fade away. Disappear into whatever quiet life broken people are supposed to live. They didn't know I'd spent every agonizing day of recovery studying, reading legal briefs from a tablet propped on my hospital tray, memorizing case law while relearning how to walk. They didn't know that the lawyer who used to send me birthday cards, Dr. James Okoye, visited me every week and saw something in me worth mentoring. And they certainly didn't know that when I'd finally been discharged, I didn't go back to my old life. I built a new one. One where I didn't need their approval, their acknowledgement, or their love. I just needed the law. And today the law was on my side. Growing up in the Chen household meant understanding your place early. I learned mine before I turned 10. Derek was the firstborn, the golden child, the one whose little league games dad never missed and whose report cards hung on the refrigerator even when they were just average. I was the second, the afterthought, the one who existed somewhere in the blurry background of family photos. It wasn't that they hated me. That would have required more energy than they were willing to spend. It was more that I simply didn't register. When Derek announced he wanted to go to business school, Dad pulled strings to get him into his alma mater. When I got accepted to law school on a full academic scholarship, Mom sent a text that said congratulations with a period at the end. No exclamation point. Just a period. Like she was confirming a dentist appointment. I stopped expecting more after a while. Stopped hoping that maybe one day they'd look at me the way they looked at Derek, with pride that wasn't conditional or performative. I focused on school instead. On building a future that didn't depend on their validation. I graduated top of my class, passed the bar on my first attempt, and got hired at a small nonprofit law firm that specialized in civil rights cases. The pay was terrible. The hours were worse. But for the first time in my life, I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Something that made me more than just the forgettable daughter of the Chen family. Then Derek started his company. Chen Development Group promised luxury condos and mixed-use spaces that would revitalize neglected neighborhoods. On paper it sounded great. In reality, it was a machine that displaced low-income families, skirted environmental regulations, and lined the pockets of investors while leaving communities worse off than before. I saw the complaints piling up, the lawsuits from residents, the reports of contaminated soil and water. I even tried to talk to Derek about it once, during a stiff Thanksgiving dinner where everyone pretended we were a functional family. He laughed it off, told me I didn't understand business, and went back to talking to Dad about profit margins. Mom just sipped her wine and changed the subject to Vanessa's new interior design project. That was the last family dinner I attended. Not because I stormed out or made a scene. I just stopped going. And no one noticed. No one called to ask why. No one checked in. I became a ghost in my own family, and they didn't even realize I'd left. When the accident happened, I was driving home from a deposition in the middle of a December snowstorm. Highway 26 was a nightmare, slick with black ice and low visibility. I remember seeing the headlights swerve into my lane. I remember the impact, the sound of metal crushing, and then nothing. Just darkness. For 8 months I lived in that darkness. The doctors later told me it was a miracle I survived. Severe traumatic brain injury, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. They didn't expect me to wake up, and if I did, they didn't expect me to be the same. But I woke up, and when I did, I was alone. Caroline, the nurse, became the closest thing I had to family during those first few weeks. She was the one who helped me through the panic attacks when I realized how much of my body I'd lost control of. She was the one who encouraged me to try physical therapy even when every muscle screamed in protest. She was the one who sat with me in the evenings when the hospital got quiet and the loneliness became unbearable. One night, about 2 weeks after I'd woken up, I finally asked her the question I'd been too afraid to voice. Did anyone come to visit me while I was under? She hesitated, and I knew the answer before she spoke. Your brother came once, she said quietly. About a month after you were admitted. He stayed for maybe 10 minutes. Asked about your condition. Then he left. I felt something crack inside me. Something I didn't even know was still holding together. And my parents? She shook her head. I'm sorry, sweetie. I nodded, swallowed the tears, and thanked her. That night, lying in the dark with machines beeping around me, I made a decision. I wasn't going to waste any more time hoping they'd change. I wasn't going to keep waiting for the love that was never going to come. I was going to survive. And then I was going to rebuild myself into someone they could never dismiss again. Dr. James Okoye was a civil rights attorney with a reputation for taking on cases no one else would touch. I'd worked under him briefly before the accident, and he'd always treated me with a respect I wasn't used to. When he showed up at Mercy General with a stack of legal journals and a container of homemade soup from his wife, I almost cried. He visited every week after that. Sometimes we talked about cases. Sometimes we just sat in silence. But he never made me feel like a burden. Never looked at me with pity. He saw potential where everyone else saw damage. 6 months into my recovery, when I could finally sit up without assistance and hold a conversation without my words slurring, he made me an offer. When you get out of here, come work. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With me. Part-time at first. We'll build you back up. I stared at him, confused. Why would you want someone like me? Someone like you, he repeated, shaking his head. Maya, you're one of the smartest attorneys I've ever worked with. What happened to you doesn't change that. But I can't even walk properly yet. You will. And when you do, you're going to be unstoppable. I didn't believe him at the time, but I held on to his words like a lifeline. They became the thing I repeated to myself during the painful hours of physical therapy, during the speech exercises, during the moments when I wanted to give up because the gap between who I used to be and who I was now felt insurmountable. Took another year before I was discharged. Another 6 months before I could walk without a cane. But I did it. And the day I walked into Dr. Okoye's office on my own 2 feet, wearing a suit I'd bought with money I'd saved from disability payments, he stood up and shook my hand like I'd just won a Supreme Court case. Welcome back, he said. Now let's get to work. The case against Chen Development Group started small. A handful of families from a neighborhood in North Portland reached out to our firm after discovering that the luxury condos Derek's company had built were sitting on improperly remediated industrial land. Their kids were getting sick. Their water tested positive for lead and arsenic. And when they tried to get answers, they were stonewalled by lawyers and PR teams. Dr. Okoye assigned the case to me. I think he knew what it meant. Knew that buried in the corporate filings and environmental reports, I'd find my family's name. And I did. Derek was the CEO. Vanessa sat on the board. My mother had invested a significant amount of capital into the project. Even my father's consulting firm had been hired to smooth over zoning issues. They'd all profited while people suffered. I spent 2 years building the case, interviewing families, gathering evidence, deposing experts. I worked 16-hour days, fueled by something sharper than anger. It was clarity. For the first time in my life, I had a purpose that was entirely mine. Not shaped by their expectations or their neglect. Just mine. When we finally filed the lawsuit, it made regional headlines. Chen Development Group faced with environmental violations and negligence. I watched the news coverage from my small apartment in the Pearl District, sipping tea and feeling nothing but calm. My name wasn't mentioned in the articles. The firm kept lead counsel anonymous until the trial. So Derek had no idea. None of them did. They probably thought I was still struggling somewhere, maybe working a low-level admin job, maybe still in recovery. They never imagined I'd be the one holding the match to everything they built on lies. The morning of the preliminary hearing, I woke up before dawn. Not because I was nervous, but because my body had learned during those months in the hospital that sleep wasn't always a refuge. Sometimes it was just a place where memories replayed on an endless loop. The accident. The darkness. The moment I realized no one was coming. I made coffee in the small kitchen of my loft, watching the city slowly come alive through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Portland in November had a particular kind of gray to it, the kind that made everything look softer, almost forgiving. But there was nothing soft about what was coming today. I'd prepared for this moment with the kind of precision that only comes from having lost everything once before. Every document was organized. Every witness statement cross-referenced. Every potential objection anticipated. Dr. Okoye had taught me that the law favored those who were meticulous, and I'd taken that lesson to heart in ways that went beyond legal strategy. Control what you can control, he told me once. Let go of the rest. I controlled my preparation. I couldn't control how my family would react when they saw me. The courthouse was already busy when I arrived. Lawyers in expensive suits rushing past with their wheeled briefcases, clerks carrying stacks of files, families waiting anxiously on benches for their cases to be called. I moved through the crowd with purpose, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Courtroom 5 was on the 3rd floor, at the end of a long hallway lined with portraits of former judges whose stern faces seemed to watch everyone who passed. I found a bench outside the courtroom and sat down, placing my briefcase beside me. My hands rested in my lap, fingers interlaced, steady. The tremor that used to run through them during moments of stress had disappeared somewhere between my 100th physical therapy session and the day I'd won my first case back. Now there was only certainty. I heard them before I saw them. Vanessa's voice carried down the hallway, bright and artificial in that way people sound when they're performing confidence they don't quite feel. She was talking about some charity gala, something about silent auctions and table arrangements, and I could picture her exactly as she'd always been. Perfectly styled hair. Designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. A smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then Derek's voice, deeper, more controlled. He was talking to someone on the phone about damage control, about managing the narrative, about ensuring their investors didn't get spooked. All business. Always business. My mother's heels came next, that particular sharp click that I'd learned to recognize as a child. It meant she was irritated about something, probably the inconvenience of having to appear in court at all. And finally, my father's measured gait, steady and unhurried. The walk of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. They rounded the corner, and for a brief moment, I saw them as they were. Not as the towering figures of my childhood, but as people. Flawed. Fragile in ways they'd never admit. Complicit. Derek saw me first. His eyes passed over me without recognition, the way you'd glance at a stranger in a waiting room. He was about to look away when something made him pause. Maybe it was the way I was sitting. Maybe it was something in my posture that triggered a distant memory. He stared for a second longer, his brow furrowing slightly, and then Vanessa pulled his attention away with a question about their lawyer. My mother didn't even look in my direction. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, her face set in that expression of perpetual dissatisfaction I knew so well. My father nodded to someone across the hall, a colleague probably, and adjusted his tie. They walked past me, all four of them, close enough that I could smell Vanessa's perfume, the same expensive scent she'd worn to every family gathering I'd ever attended, close enough that I could hear my mother sigh with impatience. And they had no idea who I was. I watched them disappear into the courtroom, and something inside me settled. This was it. The moment I'd been preparing for. Not with anger or vindictiveness, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. The courtroom was smaller than the ones you see on television. No dramatic vaulted ceilings or grand jury boxes. Just functional wood paneling, fluorescent lights, and rows of benches that had seen decades of human drama play out. The Chen family sat on the left side with their legal team, 3 attorneys in matching Navy suits who probably billed $800 an hour. Marcus Whitmore, Derek's business partner, sat beside them, his expression carefully neutral. They looked prepared, confident, like people who'd never lost anything they couldn't buy back. The plaintiffs sat on the right side, families who'd saved for weeks to take time off work for this hearing, parents whose children had elevated lead levels in their blood, elderly residents who'd lived in North Portland their whole lives and watched their neighborhood get poisoned for profit. Mrs. Dawson, a grandmother of 4, sat in the front row wearing her church clothes. Mr. and Mrs. Keebway held hands, their faces tired but determined. These were my clients. Not because they could pay me, but because someone needed to stand up for them. Because I knew what it felt like to be dismissed by people who thought they were untouchable. I entered through the side door reserved for counsel, and the room went quiet in that particular way courtrooms do when proceedings are about to begin. I walked to the plaintiff's table, set down my briefcase, and began removing my files. I could feel eyes on me. Could sense the moment when Derek's lawyer leaned over to whisper something to him. Could hear the sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind me. But I didn't turn around. Not yet. Judge Patricia Sullivan entered, and we all rose. She was a black woman in her early 60s with gray locks pulled back in an elegant bun and a reputation for suffering no nonsense from anyone regardless of how expensive their suit was. She'd been on the bench for 20 years and had seen every trick in the book. I respected her immensely. The bailiff called the court to order, announced the case number, and Judge Sullivan settled into her seat with the efficiency of someone who had 17 more cases to get through today. She looked at the defense table first. Counsel for the defense, please state your appearance for the record. Jonathan Reeves stood, all polished confidence. Jonathan Reeves of Reeves & Associates, appearing on behalf of Chen Development Group and associated defendants. Judge Sullivan nodded and turned to our side. Counsel for the plaintiffs. I stood, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Maya Chen of Okoye & Partners, appearing on behalf of the plaintiff class. The silence that followed was profound. I didn't look at my family. Didn't need to. I could feel the shock radiating from their side of the room like heat from pavement in summer. Judge Sullivan's eyebrow raised slightly, the only indication that she'd noted the shared last name. But her expression remained neutral. She'd seen stranger things. Thank you, counsel. Mr. Reeves, your motion. But before Jonathan Reeves could speak, I heard a sound from the defense table. A chair scraping back. Someone standing abruptly. Your Honor, Derek's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat. Your Honor, I need to object to opposing counsel. There's a clear conflict of interest here. Judge Sullivan's gaze shifted to him, sharp and unamused. Mr. Chen, you are not an attorney and you are not representing yourself pro se. Sit down. But she's my sister, he said, and the words tumbled out desperately. She can't be the lawyer on this case. She's family. We thought she was, we thought. He trailed off, realizing too late that he was only making things worse. Judge Sullivan's expression didn't change. She folded her hands on the bench and spoke with the kind of calm that experienced judges use right before they destroy someone's argument. Mr. Chen, unless you're alleging that Ms. Chen has a financial interest in your company or stands to personally benefit from this lawsuit beyond her legal fees, there is no conflict of interest. The fact that you share a last name is irrelevant to these proceedings. Now sit down before I hold you in contempt. Derek sat. But the damage was done. Everyone in the courtroom now knew exactly who I was. And more importantly, they knew that my own family had just tried to disqualify me out of sheer panic. The hearing proceeded, but the energy had shifted. Jonathan Reeves tried to regain his footing, arguing that our environmental claims were speculative, and that the plaintiffs hadn't demonstrated sufficient harm to warrant a class action. I listened carefully, making notes, waiting for my turn. When Judge Sullivan nodded to me, I stood and approached the podium. I didn't bring notes. I'd memorized every word I needed to say. Your Honor, the defense would have this court believe that contaminated drinking water and elevated lead levels in children are speculative harms. They would have us accept that multiple independent environmental reports, all showing the same patterns of contamination, are somehow coincidental. I paused, letting that sink in. They would have us ignore the testimonies of medical professionals who've documented the health impacts on these families. And perhaps most tellingly, they would have us overlook the internal emails and documents that show Chen Development Group was aware of the contamination risks before construction even began and chose to proceed anyway. I saw Jonathan Reeves shift uncomfortably. We'd obtained those emails through discovery, and they were devastating. Clear evidence that the company had prioritized profit over safety. I continued. The plaintiffs aren't asking for speculation to be treated as fact, Your Honor. They're asking for facts to be treated as facts. They're asking that the law apply equally to everyone, regardless of wealth or influence. They're asking for what they were promised when they invested their life savings into homes they believed were safe. Justice. When I finished, Judge Sullivan was writing something down. She didn't look up immediately, and the courtroom remained silent. Finally, she set down her pen. I'm going to allow this case to proceed to trial. The defense's motion to dismiss is denied. The plaintiff class will be certified pending final review of the criteria. But based on what I've seen today, I'm satisfied that the prerequisites are met. There was a collective exhale from the plaintiff's side. Mrs. Dawson covered her mouth with her hand. Mr. Keebway squeezed his wife's shoulder. These were people who'd been fighting for so long to be heard, and for the first time someone with power was listening. We'll reconvene in 30 days for a scheduling conference, Judge Sullivan continued. In the meantime, both parties are ordered to continue discovery in good faith. And Mr. Reeves, she added, her tone sharpening, make sure your clients understand that attempting to intimidate opposing counsel, even inadvertently, will not be tolerated in my courtroom. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor, Jonathan said quickly. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and Judge Sullivan exited. The moment she was gone, chaos erupted on the defense side. Derek was on his feet, trying to push past his lawyers to get to me. Vanessa grabbed his arm, hissing something I couldn't hear. My mother sat frozen, her face pale. My father stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between shock and what might have been shame. I calmly packed my briefcase, taking my time. Mrs. Dawson approached me, tears in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means. I do, I said gently. And we're going to see this through. As I turned to leave, Derek finally broke free from his lawyers and intercepted me near the courtroom door. Maya, wait. I stopped but didn't turn around. Just waited. What the hell are you doing, he said, his voice low and furious. You're suing your own family. Are you insane? I turned slowly to face him. For the first time in 3 years, I looked my brother directly in the eye. I'm representing families you poisoned for profit. The fact that we're related is irrelevant. You didn't even tell us you were awake, he said, and something in his voice almost sounded hurt. We thought you were still recovering. You thought wrong. You never even called to find out. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. What's not fair, Derek, is leaving someone in a coma for 8 months without a single visit. What's not fair is building luxury condos on contaminated land and lying to families about it. What's not fair is thinking you can buy your way out of consequences. Vanessa appeared at his side, her face flushed with anger. You're doing this for revenge, aren't you? This is because you've always been jealous of Derek. I looked at her, this woman who'd never spoken more than polite pleasantries to me at family dinners, and felt nothing but pity. This isn't about revenge, Vanessa. This is about accountability, something your family has never had to face. My mother's voice cut through the tension. Maya, please. I turned. She stood a few feet away, her hands clasped in front of her like she was praying. Let's talk about this privately. Like a family. We're not a family, Mom. I said it quietly without malice. Just fact. A family shows up. A family cares whether you live or die. You had 8 months to prove you were my family and you chose not to. Her face crumpled, but I didn't stay to watch. I walked past all of them, through the courtroom doors, and into the hallway where Dr. Okoye was waiting. He'd watched the whole thing from the back row. How do you feel? He asked. Free, I said. And I meant it. The days following the hearing were strange. My phone, which had been silent for years except for work calls, suddenly filled with messages. Distant cousins I hadn't heard from since childhood. Family friends who'd always treated me like wallpaper. Even an aunt who'd never remembered my birthday sent a long text about how families should stick together. I deleted them all without responding. What surprised me more were the emails from former colleagues, people I'd worked with before the accident who'd heard about the case. Messages of support. Offers to help with research. One even included a donation to help cover costs for the plaintiffs. The legal community was small and word traveled fast. By the end of the week, the case had been picked up by local news. Attorney sues own family's company over environmental violations. The headlines were sensational, but the reporting was fair. They interviewed Mrs. Dawson, who spoke eloquently about her grandson's health issues. They showed footage of the contaminated site. And they noted that Chun Development Group had declined to comment. I didn't give interviews. Didn't need to. The case would speak for itself. Dr. Okoye and I worked late most nights preparing for trial. He'd bring dinner from whatever takeout place was still open, and we'd spread documents across the conference room table, building our strategy piece by piece. You know they're going to come after you harder now, he said one evening, looking up from a deposition transcript. They'll try to make this personal. Discredit you. Paint you as vindictive. Let them try, I said. Everything we're alleging is documented. They can attack my character all they want. It won't change the facts. He smiled slightly. You've come a long way from the woman who used to second-guess every argument. I had good teachers. The truth was, the accident had burned away the part of me that needed approval. When you wake up from 8 months of nothing and realize no one missed you, you stop caring about being liked. You start caring about being right. My mother tried to visit my apartment one Saturday morning. The doorman called up to ask if I'd see her, and I said no. She tried again the following week. Again I declined. She finally resorted to sending a letter, delivered by courier, written on her expensive stationery that smelled faintly of lavender. Maya, it began. I don't know what I did to make you hate us so much. I know we weren't perfect, but we're still your family. Your father and I are worried about you. This lawsuit is tearing our family apart. Please let's sit down and talk. There's always a way to work things out. Love, Mom. I read it once, then filed it with the other case documents. Not because it was evidence, but because it was a reminder. They still didn't get it. Still thought this was about hurt feelings or sibling rivalry. Still believed that love was something you could claim without ever actually demonstrating. They were about to learn otherwise. Discovery continued, and with each deposition the picture became clearer. Derek had known about the soil contamination reports. Vanessa had been in meetings where the decision was made to proceed despite environmental concerns. My father's consulting firm had helped rezone the land by downplaying the risks in their reports. And my mother's investment had been contingent on the project moving forward quickly, cutting corners if necessary. They were all complicit. Not cartoon villains, just people who'd convinced themselves that profit justified risk, that poor families didn't have the resources to fight back, that they were too insulated by wealth and connections to ever face real consequences. We deposed Marcus Whitmore, Derek's business partner, and he cracked under pressure. Admitted that there had been discussions about remediation costs being too high. Confirmed that they'd chosen a cheaper contractor who'd done substandard work. Gave us emails that showed Derek personally approving decisions that violated EPA guidelines. Jonathan Reeves tried to walk back the testimony, but the damage was done. By the time we were 3 months into discovery, their legal strategy had shifted from denial to mitigation. They started making settlement offers. First to the plaintiffs directly, trying to bypass our firm. When that failed, they approached Dr. Okoye with a number. A significant number. Enough to make the families whole and then some. Dr. Okoye brought it to me on a Wednesday afternoon. They're offering $4.2 million, he said. Distributed among the plaintiff class, medical monitoring for the children, and relocation assistance for anyone who wants to move. I studied the offer. It was more than I'd expected them to go to, which meant they were scared. What do the families want to do? Some want to take it, he admitted. It's life-changing money for them. Others want to see this through to trial. They want accountability, not just compensation. I nodded. Then we let them decide. But make sure they understand that if we go to trial and win, the punitive damages could be significantly higher. And if we lose, they get nothing. He looked at me carefully. What do you want, Maya? I want them to admit what they did. I want it on the record. I want every other developer who thinks they can cut corners in poor neighborhoods to see what happens when they get caught. But that's not my decision to make. We scheduled a meeting with all the plaintiffs, gathered in the community center in North Portland, where this had all started. I presented the settlement offer honestly, without trying to influence their decision. Some families took it. 12 out of the 43 households accepted the settlement, and I made sure they got every penny they were owed plus our firm's agreement to waive fees for those families. The remaining 31 families voted to continue to trial. Mrs. Dawson stood up during the meeting and said something I'll never forget. My grandson deserves more than money. He deserves to know that what happened to him mattered. That the people who did this couldn't just write a check and walk away. So we prepared for war. The trial date was set for early March, which gave us 4 months to finalize our preparation. For months of 16-hour days, weekends spent reviewing medical records, evenings practicing opening statements in front of Dr. Okoye, until every word felt natural. I'd handled cases before the accident, but nothing of this magnitude. Nothing where the opposing side had unlimited resources and a team of attorneys whose sole job was to find weaknesses in our arguments and exploit them mercilessly. The defense filed motion after motion trying to delay the trial. Requests for extensions. Challenges to our expert witnesses. Attempts to exclude evidence on procedural grounds. Judge Sullivan denied most of them, but the one she granted meant more work, more depositions, more late nights parsing through technical environmental reports that read like they'd been written specifically to confuse anyone without a doctorate in chemistry. I learned more about soil contamination, groundwater pollution, and the long-term health effects of heavy metal exposure than I ever thought possible. Learned that lead doesn't just make children sick in obvious ways. It steals IQ points. Damages developing brains in ways that don't show up until years later when kids struggle in school, can't focus, fall behind their peers. Learned that arsenic increases cancer risk, causes skin lesions, destroys organs slowly over time. These weren't abstract concepts. These were things happening to real children who trusted that the adults in charge wouldn't poison them for profit. I met with each family individually, heard their stories. Mrs. Dawson told me about her grandson Elijah, who'd been a bright, energetic 6-year-old before they moved into the new condo. Within a year he started having behavioral problems, trouble sleeping, unexplained stomach pain. The pediatrician ran tests and found lead levels 3 times higher than what's considered safe. He was 8 now, in special education classes, struggling with things that used to come easily. She cried when she told me, not from sadness but from rage that anyone could do this to a child and think money would make it right. The Kibwe family had a different story but the same ending. They'd emigrated from Kenya 15 years ago, worked multiple jobs, saved every penny to buy a home in a neighborhood that was supposed to be up and coming. The condo was their American dream. Their daughter Amara started getting sick within months of moving in. Chronic headaches, nosebleeds, fatigue so severe she'd fall asleep at her desk in school. The doctors couldn't figure it out until someone finally tested their water and found arsenic levels that exceeded federal limits by a factor of 10. They'd reported it to the building management, to the city, to anyone who would listen. They were ignored, dismissed, told they were overreacting. Every family had a version of the same story. Trust betrayed. Health stolen. Voices silenced. And every time I heard another one, my resolve hardened a little more. This wasn't about my family anymore. It had never really been about them. It was about a system that allowed people with money and power to treat everyone else as expendable. Dr. Okoye worried about me during this time. He'd catch me working at 2 in the morning, still at the office when everyone else had gone home. He'd remind me to eat, to sleep, to take care of myself. "You're no good to these families if you burn out," he'd say. But I couldn't stop, because every hour I worked was an hour closer to making sure that what happened to these families, what happened to me in that hospital bed, wouldn't happen to someone else without consequences. The defense team tried a different approach as trial drew closer. They started reaching out to the plaintiffs directly again, offering individual settlements with non-disclosure agreements, trying to peel away our witnesses one by one. It was legal but deeply unethical, and Judge Sullivan wasn't pleased when we brought it to her attention. She issued an order prohibiting ex parte communications with represented parties, but the damage was done. 2 more families took settlements, too exhausted to keep fighting. That left us with 29 families. 29 households willing to stand up in court and tell their stories. 29 chances to get this right. I saw my brother once during those months, purely by accident. I was leaving a deposition at a neutral location downtown, when I spotted him getting out of his car in the parking garage. He saw me at the same moment. We both froze. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me, and I debated whether to just get in my car and leave. But something made me stay. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking older than I remembered. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, and his usually perfect hair looked like he'd been running his hands through it. "You look good," he said finally. "Healthy." I didn't respond, just waited. "I didn't know what happened to you," he continued. "After the accident. Mom said you were stable, that you were going to be fine. So I figured you didn't want visitors. That you'd reach out when you were ready." "That's a convenient story," I said. "But we both know it's not true." His jaw tightened. "What do you want me to say, Maya? That I should have visited? Fine. I should have. I was a terrible brother. Does that make you happy?" "No," I said quietly. "It just makes me sad. Sad that you still don't understand why what you did, what all of you did, was unforgivable. It wasn't just about not visiting. It was about showing me exactly how little I mattered. And now you're mad because I had the audacity to survive and become someone you can't ignore." He looked away. "This lawsuit is going to destroy everything Dad and I built." "Good," I said. "Because you built it on other people's suffering." He shook his head. "You've changed. You used to understand family loyalty." "No, Derek. I used to be desperate for family that didn't exist. There's a difference." I got in my car and drove away. Watched him standing there in the rearview mirror, looking lost. I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Just the quiet certainty that I'd made the right choice. The week before trial I barely slept. Not from nerves but from preparation. Dr. Okoye had assembled a team of 3 junior attorneys to help with the workload, and we turned our conference room into a war room. Whiteboards covered with timelines. Boxes of exhibits organized by witness. Practice cross-examinations that went until midnight. We brought in a jury consultant who helped us think through how to present complex scientific evidence in ways that would resonate with regular people. We hired expert witnesses, environmental engineers and pediatric toxicologists and public health researchers who could explain in clear terms exactly what Chen Development Group had done and what the consequences were. The defense had their own experts, well-paid professionals who would testify that the contamination levels weren't that bad, that the health effects couldn't be definitively linked to the soil and water, that the company had followed all applicable regulations. It would be our job to dismantle those arguments piece by piece, to show that regulations had been ignored, that internal documents contradicted their public statements, that they'd known the risks and proceeded anyway. Jonathan Reeves called me 2 days before trial. It was late, almost 9 at night, and I almost didn't answer. But curiosity got the better of me. "Maya," he said, and his voice had lost some of its courtroom polish. "I'm calling to make one final settlement offer. Off the record." I waited. $7.5 million, he said. Full remediation of the site. Medical monitoring for all affected families until the children turn 18. And a public acknowledgement that mistakes were made in the development process. It was a good offer. Better than good. It was almost everything we'd asked for. Almost. "What about punitive damages?" I asked. "What about holding individuals accountable?" He sighed. You know I can't offer that. The company will make this right financially, but criminal liability is off the table. Then we'll see you in court, I said. Maya, be reasonable. This is a generous offer. You could be a hero to these families. Or you could roll the dice at trial and potentially lose everything. I agreed. But at least I'd know I didn't let them buy their way out of accountability. There was a long silence. Your brother wants to talk to you, he said finally. He asked me to arrange a meeting. No. He says he has things he wants to explain. Things about the accident. That got my attention. What things? I don't know. He wouldn't tell me. But he seemed genuine, Maya. He seemed like he actually wants to make amends. I closed my eyes. This was a trap. Had to be. A last-ditch effort to throw me off balance before trial. And yet some small part of me, the part that still remembered being a kid desperate for her big brother's attention, wanted to hear what he had to say. I'll think about it, I said. Let me know by tomorrow. We need to finalize our strategy. I hung up and sat in the darkness of my apartment, staring out at the city lights. What could Derek possibly have to say about the accident? He hadn't been there. Hadn't been involved. Unless there was something I didn't know. Something he'd kept hidden. I made myself a cup of tea and pulled out the accident report I'd requested from the police department months after I'd woken up. I'd read it dozens of times. Black ice. Poor visibility. The other driver had been cited for reckless driving, but the case had been settled quietly. I'd never pursued it further because I'd been too focused on recovery, then on building the case against Chen Development Group. Now I looked at it with fresh eyes. The other driver's name was Michael Torres, age 24, driving a company vehicle. I never thought to check which company. I pulled up the full police report on my laptop and scrolled through the attachments until I found the insurance information. The vehicle had been registered to Chen Development Group. My hands went cold. I read it again to make sure I wasn't misreading, but there it was in black and white. The truck that hit me had belonged to my brother's company. I grabbed my phone and called Dr. Okoye. I know it's late, I said when he answered, but I need you to pull every employment record for Chen Development Group going back 4 years. Specifically anyone named Michael Torres. What's going on? He asked, instantly alert. I think my accident wasn't an accident. There was silence on the other end. Then I'll have it by morning. I didn't sleep that night. Just sat at my kitchen table going through every detail I could remember. The weather had been terrible, yes. But the truck had swerved into my lane aggressively. I'd always assumed it was just someone driving too fast for conditions. But what if it wasn't? What if someone had wanted me gone? I thought back to the weeks before the accident. I'd been working on a different case then. A housing discrimination suit against a developer who'd been refusing to rent to families with Section 8 vouchers. It was small compared to what I was doing now, but I'd been making noise, getting media attention, making developers in Portland nervous. Had I been getting too close to something? Had someone decided I was a problem that needed to be eliminated? It sounded paranoid even in my own head. But I'd learned in law school that the most obvious answer was usually correct. And the most obvious answer here was that Chen Development Group had something to hide and I'd been in the way. Dr. Okoye called at 6 in the morning. Michael Torres was employed by Chen Development Group as a site supervisor from 2018 until January 2021. He was terminated 1 week after your accident. Why would they fire him right after? I asked. Unless they were covering something up. There's more, Dr. Okoye said grimly. I pulled his driving record. 3 prior incidents of aggressive driving. 2 accidents. He never should have been driving a company vehicle. And Derek knew? The employment records show he personally signed off on Torres continuing to drive after the second accident. There was a note in his file recommending he be restricted to non-driving duties, but it was overridden. I felt something cold settle in my chest. They didn't just fail to visit me in the hospital. They might have been the reason I was there in the first place. We need to be careful with this, Dr. Okoye said. If we're going to allege this was intentional, we need ironclad proof. Otherwise it's just conspiracy theory. I know, I said. But I want to talk to Torres. Find out what really happened that night. I'll track him down, he said. But Maya, if this is true, if they deliberately tried to harm you, this case just became about a lot more than environmental violations. I understand. Good. Because you need to decide if you're ready for that fight. I've been ready, I told him. I just didn't know what I was fighting yet. By midday, we'd located Michael Torres. He was working construction in Seattle, living in a small apartment in the Rainier Valley neighborhood. Dr. Okoye sent one of our investigators to approach him, someone who knew how to ask questions without spooking people. The investigator called back 3 hours later. He'll talk, she said. But only to you. And only off the record. When? Tomorrow. He's driving down to Portland. Says he's been waiting for someone to ask him about that night. My pulse quickened. Did he say why? No. But he sounded scared. Tell him I'll meet him, I said. Somewhere public. The investigator arranged for us to meet at a coffee shop near Waterfront Park. Neutral territory. Plenty of witnesses. I told Dr. Okoye where I was going and promised to call him the moment the meeting was over. I arrived early, ordered coffee I didn't drink, and sat at a corner table where I could see the door. Michael Torres walked in exactly on time. He was younger than I expected, though 4 years had passed since the accident. He had the build of someone who worked with his hands, broad shoulders and callous fingers. But his eyes were what struck me. Haunted. He spotted me immediately and walked over. You're Maya Chen, he said. It wasn't a question. I am. He sat down heavily. I've wanted to talk to you for 3 years. Then talk. He took a breath. The night of the accident wasn't an accident. I was told to run you off the road. The words hung in the air between us. I felt my hands grip the edge of the table but kept my voice steady. Who told you? Your brother. Derek Chen. He said you were causing problems. That you were about to expose something about the company that would cost them millions. He said if I didn't take care of it, I'd lose my job and he'd make sure I never worked construction in Oregon again. So you tried to kill me. He flinched. I didn't want to. I swear I didn't. But I had a kid on the way and bills and I was scared. I thought I'd just scare you. Make you crash but not hurt you that bad. But the roads were icy and you went into the median and... He stopped, his voice breaking. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I watched him for a long moment. He was crying now, this man who'd nearly killed me, and I felt a strange disconnect. Like I was watching this happen to someone else. Did you tell the police the truth? No. Derek's lawyers took care of everything. Paid my legal fees. Got the charges reduced. Then fired me a week later so there wouldn't be any connection. They gave me $50,000 to disappear and keep my mouth shut. And you took it. I took it, he whispered. Because I was a coward. But I can't live with it anymore. Every time I close my eyes I see your car spinning out. I see the ambulance. I think about the fact that you might have died because I was too weak to stand up to a bully in an expensive suit. I lean back in my chair. Why are you telling me this now? Because I heard about the trial. About what you're doing. And I realized that if you survived what I did to you and still had the guts to fight them, then maybe I could find the guts to tell the truth. Will you testify? I asked. He nodded. Yeah, I will. Whatever you need. But I need immunity. I'm not going to prison for this. I can't promise that. But I can talk to the prosecutor. If you cooperate fully, tell them everything, they might be willing to make a deal. He wiped his eyes. Okay. I pulled out my phone and called Dr. Okoye. We need to file an amended complaint, I said when he answered. And we need to contact the district attorney's office. What happened? I'll explain when I get back. But James, this just became a criminal case. The fallout was immediate. By the time I returned to the office, Dr. Okoye had already begun drafting the amended complaint. We were adding charges of attempted vehicular assault, conspiracy to commit assault, witness intimidation, and obstruction of justice. We'd also be filing a separate civil suit for the accident itself, seeking damages that would dwarf the environmental case. But more importantly, we were handing evidence to the district attorney that could result in criminal charges against Derek personally. This was no longer about contaminated land. This was about a man who tried to have his own sister killed to protect his business interests. The news broke the next morning. Local attorney alleges brother orchestrated hit and run. The story spread like wildfire. Every news outlet in Portland picked it up. By afternoon it had gone regional. By evening, national. My phone exploded with calls from reporters, but I didn't answer any of them. Dr. Okoye handled the press with a simple statement confirming that we'd filed an amended complaint, and were cooperating with law enforcement. He declined to comment further on pending litigation. The Chen family's response was swift and predictable. Their PR team released a statement calling the allegations baseless and defamatory. Derek appeared on local news looking somber and betrayed, saying he loved his sister and was devastated that she would make such horrible accusations. Vanessa went on social media posting old family photos with captions about how mental trauma can cause people to create false memories. My mother called me directly for the first time since I declined her visit. I answered because I wanted to hear what she'd say. How could you do this, she hissed. How could you accuse your own brother of trying to murder you? Do you have any idea what this is doing to our family? Because it's true, I said calmly. And I have a witness willing to testify under oath. She made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. Michael Torres? He's a criminal. A liar. Derek was trying to help him, and this is how he repays us. You're being manipulated, Maya. You always were too trusting. I hung up. There was no point in continuing the conversation. She'd already chosen which version of reality she wanted to believe. And it wasn't one where her golden child had tried to kill his sister to protect his profit margins. Judge Sullivan called an emergency hearing to address the amended complaint. Both legal teams appeared before her in chambers rather than open court. Jonathan Reeves was furious, arguing that we were trying to prejudice the jury pool, and that the timing was deliberately calculated to damage his clients before trial. These are inflammatory allegations with no credible evidence, he said. This is a transparent attempt to gain leverage through public opinion rather than legal merit. Judge Sullivan turned to me. Ms. Chen, do you have evidence to support these new allegations? We do, Your Honor. We have a witness who was directly involved and is willing to testify. We have employment records showing the connection between the witness and Chen Development Group. We have financial records showing payments made to the witness immediately after the incident. And we're working with the district attorney's office to investigate further. She considered this. Mr. Reeves, has your client been contacted by law enforcement regarding these allegations? Not that I'm aware of, Your Honor. Then I suggest you prepare him for that possibility. As for the amended complaint, I'm going to allow it. The original trial date will stand, but the new allegations will be severed into a separate proceeding to be scheduled later. We're not going to delay justice for the families who've been waiting for their day in court. But Ms. Chen, she fixed me with a hard stare. If I find out you've brought these charges in bad faith or as a litigation tactic, there will be serious consequences. Do you understand? I understand, Your Honor. And I stand by every word in that complaint. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in early March. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. Family members of the plaintiffs sat on one side, Chen Development Group supporters on the other. My family was notably absent from the defense side. Derek sat with his lawyers, but Vanessa, my mother, and my father were nowhere to be seen, probably on advice of counsel, trying to distance themselves from the proceedings now that criminal charges were looming. Jury selection took 2 days. We wanted people who understood what it meant to be powerless against institutions, who knew what it felt like to be dismissed and ignored. The defense wanted people who respected business and didn't think with their emotions. In the end, we got a diverse panel. Teachers and nurses and small business owners. People who worked for a living and understood that actions had consequences. Opening statements began on Wednesday. Jonathan Reeves went first, painting Chen Development Group as responsible developers who'd been blindsided by unforeseeable contamination. He made Derek sound like a victim of circumstance, a man trying to revitalize neighborhoods who'd been let down by contractors and regulatory agencies. He portrayed the plaintiffs as opportunistic, looking for someone to blame for problems that existed long before the condos were built. It was a polished performance, smooth and reasonable and utterly dishonest. Then it was my turn. I stood and walked to the jury box, looked each juror in the eye before I began speaking. I didn't use notes. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I began, my voice steady and clear. This case is about a choice. A choice that Derek Chen and Chen Development Group made when they decided that profit mattered more than people, more than children, more than the families who trusted them to build safe homes. I walked slowly along the jury box, making eye contact with each person. The defense will tell you this was all a terrible mistake, that they didn't know about the contamination. that they followed the rules. But we're going to show you documents, emails, reports that prove they knew exactly what they were doing. We're going to introduce you to families whose lives were forever changed because of that choice. And we're going to ask you to hold them accountable. I paused, letting the words settle. There's a little boy named Elijah who used to love reading. He was in the gifted program at his school. Now he struggles to make it through a single page because the lead poisoning he suffered has damaged his ability to concentrate. There's a girl named Amara who dreamed of becoming a doctor. She's 14 now and she's already had 2 surgeries to remove tumors caused by arsenic exposure. These aren't statistics. These are children who deserved better. I returned to our table but remained standing. The defense will try to make this complicated. They'll bring in experts with fancy degrees who'll use technical language to confuse you. But at its core, this case is simple. Did Chen Development Group know they were building on contaminated land? Yes. Did they choose to proceed anyway without proper remediation? Yes. Did families suffer because of that choice? Yes. Your job is to decide what that choice is worth, what accountability looks like, and whether people with money and power should face the same consequences as everyone else. I sat down. The courtroom was silent for a moment, and then Judge Sullivan called for a brief recess. Dr. Okoye squeezed my shoulder as we left the courtroom. That was perfect, he said quietly. You had them. Now we just have to prove it. The next 3 weeks were a blur of testimony and evidence. We called our plaintiffs first, let them tell their stories in their own words. Mrs. Dawson testified about Elijah, her voice breaking as she described watching her bright grandson struggle with things that used to come easily. The Kibwe's testified together, Mr. Kibwe translating for his wife whose English was limited, both of them holding hands as they described Amara's illness and the fear that gripped them every time she complained of feeling tired. Family after family took the stand, showed the jury medical records, test results, bills they couldn't pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover. The emotional toll was exhausting, but it was necessary. The jury needed to see these people as human beings, not abstract victims. Then we brought in our expert witnesses. Dr. Sarah Vance, a pediatric toxicologist from Johns Hopkins, explained in clear, accessible language how lead and arsenic affect developing brains and bodies. She walked the jury through the science without talking down to them, used analogies they could understand. Lead in the body is like sand in an engine, she said. It gets into systems that are supposed to run smoothly and it grinds them down. For a child whose brain is still developing, even small amounts can cause permanent damage. Our environmental engineer, Dr. Robert Hastings, testified about the soil samples we'd taken from the site. He showed the jury maps with color-coded contamination levels, explained how the toxins had leached into the groundwater, demonstrated with models how the construction process had actually made things worse by disturbing contaminated soil and spreading it around. The defense tried to poke holes in their testimony during cross-examination, but our experts were solid. They'd done the work. They had the data, and they didn't waver under pressure. Then we entered the documents into evidence. Internal emails from Derek to his project managers expressing concern about remediation costs. Memos from environmental consultants warning that the soil contamination exceeded safe levels. Budget spreadsheets showing where corners had been cut to keep the project profitable. And most damning of all, a recorded phone call between Derek and Marcus Whitmore, where they discussed whether anyone would actually test the soil after construction was complete. The audio was clear. Derek's voice saying, "If we remediate properly, we'll blow the budget by $2 million. But if we just cover it up and hope nobody notices, we can still hit our profit targets." Marcus responding, "What about liability?" Derek laughing, "These are Section 8 families, Marcus. They don't have lawyers. They don't have resources. Who's going to sue us?" The jury's faces changed when they heard that recording. Whatever sympathy they might have had for Derek evaporated. This wasn't a mistake or an oversight. This was calculated indifference to human suffering. Jonathan Reeves did his best during cross-examination to muddy the waters. He suggested that our environmental testing might have been flawed. He brought in defense experts who claimed the contamination levels weren't as bad as we'd portrayed. He argued that correlation didn't equal causation, that we couldn't definitively prove the health problems were caused by the condos rather than other environmental factors. But it all rang hollow against the weight of our evidence. against the testimony of parents who'd watched their children get sick, against Derek's own words on that recording. The defense rested after 2 weeks, and we prepared for closing arguments. Dr. Okoye and I worked through the night, refining our message, anticipating every argument the defense would make. We knew this was our last chance to speak directly to the jury before they deliberated. Everything came down to this. Jonathan Reeves delivered his closing first. He was eloquent as always, painting Derek as a well-intentioned businessman who'd been let down by contractors and consultants. He emphasized the settlement offers that had been made, suggested that proved his client's good faith. He tried to minimize the health impacts, argued that many of the symptoms could have other causes, and he urged the jury not to let emotion override reason, not to punish his client for what amounted to an unfortunate situation, rather than deliberate wrongdoing. It was a good argument, competent, professional, but it couldn't erase what the jury had heard over the past 3 weeks. Then it was my turn. I stood and faced the jury one last time. Throughout this trial I said, "You've heard the defense talk about mistakes and misunderstandings, about how complicated development projects are, about how no one could have predicted what would happen. But you've also heard Derek Chen's own voice on that recording. You've heard him weigh the cost of doing the right thing against his profit margin. You've heard him gamble with children's health because he believed the families living in those condos didn't have the power to fight back." I walked along the jury box again, slower this time. He was wrong about that. These families did fight back. They organized. They gathered evidence. They found attorneys willing to take on a powerful developer. And they asked you, 12 ordinary citizens, to hold that developer accountable. I paused. The defense wants you to believe this is complicated. But it's not. Derek Chen had a choice. Spend the money to properly clean contaminated land, or cut corners and hope nobody noticed. He chose profit over safety. And now he's asking you to let him walk away because admitting what he did would be expensive and embarrassing. I returned to the center of the courtroom. You've seen the medical records. You've heard from doctors who explained the science. You've listened to parents describe watching their children suffer. And you've heard Derek Chen himself say that he didn't think these families mattered enough to protect. Your verdict is the answer to that statement. Your verdict tells everyone, in Portland and beyond, whether people like Derek Chen can poison communities without consequence, whether wealth and influence put you above accountability, whether the law protects everyone equally or just those who can afford the best lawyers. I looked each juror in the eye one final time. These families trusted the system. They believed that when they bought homes, those homes would be safe. They believed that regulations existed to protect them. They believed that if something went wrong, justice would be available to them just like it is to everyone else. Don't let them down. Hold Derek Chen accountable for the choice he made. Show him, and every other developer watching this case, that children's health is not negotiable, that communities are not disposable, that in this courtroom, everyone is equal under the law. I sat down. The courtroom was utterly silent. Judge Sullivan instructed the jury on the law, explained the standards they needed to apply, and sent them to deliberate. It was 4 in the afternoon. We didn't expect a verdict that day, but none of us wanted to leave. Dr. Okoye ordered pizza for the team. We sat in the conference room across from the courthouse, not really talking, just waiting. The plaintiffs gathered in the hallway, some praying, some pacing, all anxious. At 8:30 the bailiff called. The jury had reached a verdict. Everyone scrambled back to the courtroom. It seemed impossibly fast for such a complex case, and I couldn't decide if that was good or bad. Fast verdicts usually meant the jury was unanimous and certain. But certain about what? We filed back into our seats. The jury returned to the box. I tried to read their faces but couldn't. Judge Sullivan asked the foreperson if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The clerk took the verdict form and handed it to Judge Sullivan. She read it silently, her expression neutral, then handed it back to the clerk. The clerk cleared her throat. In the matter of Dawson et al. Versus Chen Development Group, on the question of whether the defendant knowingly built residential housing on contaminated land without proper remediation, we the jury find for the plaintiffs. I heard Mrs. Dawson gasp behind me. On the question of whether the defendant's actions directly caused harm to the plaintiff class, we find for the plaintiffs. On the question of compensatory damages, We award the plaintiff class $12.4 million. There was a murmur through the courtroom. That was nearly double what the settlement offer had been. But the clerk wasn't finished. On the question of punitive damages, we award the plaintiff class an additional $35 million. The courtroom erupted. People were crying, hugging, talking all at once. Judge Sullivan banged her gavel calling for order, but even she looked satisfied. Derek sat frozen at the defense table, his face pale. Jonathan Reeves was already whispering urgently to him, probably about appeals. But it didn't matter. We'd won. Not just won, we'd sent a message that would echo through every development company in the state. I turned to face the plaintiffs. Mrs. Dawson was sobbing, surrounded by her family. The Keebways were holding each other. People who'd been carrying the weight of this fight for years were finally able to set it down. Dr. Okoye put his hand on my shoulder. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," I corrected. But I knew what he meant. This was bigger than a legal victory. This was vindication. Proof that the invisible could become undeniable. That the dismissed could demand to be heard. Judge Sullivan dismissed the jury with thanks, and we gathered our materials. I was packing my briefcase when I felt someone standing beside me. I looked up to find my father. He looked older than I remembered, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "We need to talk," he said. "There's nothing to talk about. Your brother, he's made mistakes. But Maya, this verdict, it's going to destroy everything we've built." "Then you shouldn't have built it on lies," I said. I picked up my briefcase and started to walk away. "Your mother and I want to help you," he called after me. "We want to make things right." I stopped and turned back. "You want to make things right?" I repeated. "Where were you when I was lying in a hospital bed for 8 months? Where were you when I was learning to walk again? Where were you when I needed a family?" He had no answer. I didn't expect one. "You had your chance to be my family," I said. "Every single day for 3 years. You chose not to take it. Don't pretend now that this is about reconciliation. This is about damage control." I left him standing there and walked out of the courtroom into the cool evening air. The media was waiting outside, cameras and microphones everywhere. Dr. Okoye had prepared a statement, but I found myself wanting to say something directly. I approached the cluster of reporters and they surged forward. "Ms. Chen, how do you feel about the verdict?" "I feel grateful," I said. "Grateful to the jury for taking this seriously. Grateful to my clients for their courage. And grateful that justice, real justice, is still possible in this system. What do you say to your brother? I hope he learns from this. I hope he understands that power without accountability is just tyranny in a suit. And I hope other developers are paying attention. What's next for you?" I smiled slightly. There are a lot of families out there who need someone to fight for them. So I'll keep doing this work for as long as I can. The questions continued, but I excused myself politely and walked toward where Dr. Okoye was waiting by his car. The reporters eventually dispersed, chasing other angles for their stories. That night, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, looking out at the city. My phone had been buzzing constantly with messages. Congratulations from colleagues. Interview requests from news outlets. Even a few texts from family members I barely knew, suddenly interested in reconnecting. I ignored most of them, but there was one message I read several times. It was from Serena, my former colleague from before the accident. She'd moved to California years ago and we'd lost touch. "Just saw the news," her message said. "I always knew you were going to do something incredible. I'm so proud of you. And I'm sorry I didn't stay in better touch after everything happened." I replied simply, "Thank you. That means more than you know." Another message came in, this one from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. It was from Michael Torres. "I watched the verdict on the news. Thank you for giving me the chance to tell the truth. I know it doesn't undo what I did, but maybe it means something." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I wrote back, "It means you chose courage over fear. That always means something." The following weeks brought new developments. The district attorney announced criminal charges against Derek for conspiracy and witness tampering related to the accident. The case would be separate from the civil trial, but Michael Torres's testimony had provided enough evidence to move forward. Derek was arrested on a Tuesday morning, released on bail that afternoon, but the damage to his reputation was irreversible. Chen Development Group's stock price plummeted. Investors fled. Projects were canceled. Within a month, the company filed for bankruptcy protection. My mother tried to visit me again. This time she didn't call ahead, just showed up at my apartment building. The doorman called up and I almost said no again. But something made me agree to see her. She looked diminished somehow when she walked into my apartment. Smaller than I remembered. Less certain. She stood awkwardly in my living room, looking around at the space I'd built without her knowledge or help. "You've done well for yourself," she said finally. "I have." She nodded, wringing her hands. "Maya, I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make you forgive us." "You can't," I said gently. "That's not how this works. Mom, you don't get to ignore someone's existence and then demand forgiveness when the consequences catch up with you." Her eyes filled with tears. "I was a terrible mother to you. I know that now. I favored Derek. I let your father's priorities become mine. I told myself you were independent, that you didn't need us the way he did. But that was just an excuse for not trying." I sat down on the couch and gestured for her to do the same. She perched on the edge of the chair across from me. "Why are you here?" I asked. "What do you actually want?" "I want to understand," she said. "How you survived all of this. The accident. The recovery. Building this case. Becoming this person. How did you do it without us?" I looked at her for a long moment. "I did it because of you," I said. "Because you showed me that I couldn't rely on anyone but myself. That family wasn't something I was born into, it was something I had to create. So I created it. I found mentors like Dr. Okoye who saw value in me. I built relationships with people who showed up. And I learned that the absence of your love didn't mean I was unlovable. It just meant you were incapable of giving what I needed." She was crying openly now. "I'm so sorry, Maya." "I know," I said. "But sorry doesn't change the past. It doesn't give me back the years I spent trying to earn something you were never going to freely give." She wiped her eyes. "What can I do?" "Be better," I said simply. "Not for me. I don't need you anymore. But be better for yourself. Because the person you were, the mother who could watch her daughter lie in a coma and not visit, that's someone you have to live with. I don't." She left shortly after that. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated. Just tired. Tired of carrying the weight of their failures. Tired of explaining to them what they should have understood all along. But I also felt something like closure. The kind that comes not from reconciliation but from finally accepting that some relationships can't be saved and that's okay. The trial for Derek's criminal charges was scheduled for 6 months out. I wouldn't be directly involved since I was a victim rather than an attorney in that case, but I'd have to testify. The prospect didn't frighten me anymore. I'd already faced him in court once and won. This would just be finishing what we'd started. In the meantime, I threw myself back into work. Our firm was flooded with new cases after the verdict. People who'd been wronged by corporations and institutions finally believing that justice might be possible. Dr. Okoye and I hired 3 more attorneys and expanded our offices. We created a fund using a portion of our fees from the Chun development case to provide free legal services to families who couldn't afford representation. One afternoon about 2 months after the verdict, I was in my office reviewing a new environmental case when my assistant buzzed me. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "A young woman. Says she's a law student and she's been following your work." I almost said I was too busy, but something made me agree to a quick meeting. The young woman who entered my office was maybe 25, nervous energy radiating off her. She wore a blazer that was slightly too big and carried a worn leather portfolio. "Miss Chan," she said, extending her hand. "My name is Rachel Martinez. I'm a second-year law student at Lewis & Clark. I've been following the Chun development case since it started." I shook her hand and gestured for her to sit. "What can I do for you, Rachel?" She took a breath. "I want to be like you. I grew up in a neighborhood like the one you defended. I saw what happens when people with power don't think families like mine matter. I went to law school because I wanted to fight back, but I didn't know if it was actually possible to win. And then I watched you do it." I studied her for a moment. This young woman with fire in her eyes and hope she was trying to temper with realism. "It's hard work," I told her. "The hours are brutal. The pay is terrible compared to corporate law. You'll lose cases that should be won. You'll watch injustice happen and not be able to stop it." She nodded. "I know. But you didn't let that stop you." "No," I agreed. I didn't. Because the wins, when they come, they matter in ways that money can't measure. Do you have any openings for summer associates, she asked. Or even unpaid internships? I work for free just to learn from you. I considered this. Dr. Okoye and I had been talking about bringing on law students, creating a pipeline for the next generation of civil rights attorneys. Maybe it was time. Send me your resume and a writing sample, I said. We'll see what we can do. Her face lit up. Really? Thank you. Thank you so much. You won't regret this. As she left, practically bouncing with excitement, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Not just satisfaction from winning, but hope. Hope that the work would continue. That the fight for accountability and justice wouldn't end with me. That maybe, just maybe, we were building something that would outlast any individual case or verdict. That evening, I met Dr. Okoye for dinner at a small Ethiopian restaurant we both loved. He raised his glass in a toast. To justice, he said. I clinked my glass against his. To accountability. We ate and talked about cases, about the firm's future, about everything except my family. He knew better than to push. But as we were finishing dessert, he asked the question I knew was coming. How are you really doing, Maya? With everything. I thought about it. Considered giving the easy answer, the professional one about moving forward and focusing on work. But this was James. He'd earned honesty. I'm good, I said finally. Not perfect. I still have days where the anger catches me off guard. Where I think about the 8 months I lost and the family I never really had. But I'm good. Because I built something they can't touch. Something that matters. He nodded. You know they're going to keep trying to reconcile. Your mother especially. She'll keep showing up. I know. And I'll keep deciding whether to let her in based on what I need, not what she wants. That's healthy, he said. It means you've learned the most important lesson. Which is that you don't owe anyone access to your life. Not even family. Especially not family who only wants back in once you've proven your worth on your terms. We finished dinner and walked through the quiet streets of downtown Portland. The city had changed so much since the accident. New buildings. New businesses. But some things remained constant. The river still flowed. The bridges still stood. And people still needed someone to fight for them when the odds seemed insurmountable. Months turned into a year. Derek's criminal trial ended with a conviction on 2 counts of conspiracy and 1 count of witness tampering. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, though his lawyers were already filing appeals. Chen Development Group was liquidated. Its assets sold to pay creditors and judgments. Marcus Whitmore turned state's evidence and received probation in exchange for testimony. The $35 million punitive damage award was distributed among the plaintiff families. Some used it to move to safer neighborhoods. Others invested in their children's education. Mrs. Dawson started a foundation to provide support for families affected by environmental contamination. The money couldn't undo the harm, but it gave people options they'd never had before. And the precedent we'd set echoed through courtrooms across the state. Other environmental cases were filed citing our verdict. Developers started taking remediation more seriously. The regulations that had been ignored for so long suddenly had teeth, because everyone knew that juries would hold them accountable. I testified at Derek's sentencing hearing. The judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, and I stood before the court one final time with my brother in an orange jumpsuit sitting 20 feet away. Your Honor, I said, my brother tried to have me killed because I was inconvenient to his business model. When that failed and I survived, he and my family abandoned me in a hospital for 8 months. They made a calculation that I didn't matter. That I wasn't worth their time or attention. They were wrong. I mattered to the families I represented. I mattered to the mentors who invested in my recovery. And I mattered to myself. That's the lesson I hope my brother learns during his incarceration. That people aren't disposable. That actions have consequences. And that the measure of a person isn't their wealth or status, but whether they use whatever power they have to help or to harm. Derek didn't look at me during the statement. Didn't acknowledge my words. But I didn't need him to. This wasn't for him. It was for me. For closure. For the final period at the end of a very long sentence. After the hearing, reporters asked if I felt vindicated. I told them vindication wasn't the right word. Relief maybe. Satisfaction that justice had been served. But not vindication, because that would imply I'd been trying to prove something to my family. I hadn't. I'd been trying to prove something to myself. That I could survive the worst they could do to me and still build something meaningful. That their rejection didn't define my worth. That I was enough, all by myself, without their approval or acknowledgement. 2 years after the verdict, I stood in the same courtroom where it had all happened. But this time I was there for a different reason. Judge Sullivan was retiring, and the court was holding a ceremony to honor her decades of service. She'd asked me to speak, along with several other attorneys whose cases had shaped her legacy. I talked about what it meant to have a judge who treated everyone equally, who didn't care if you were representing wealthy defendants or struggling families, who believed that the law existed to protect everyone, not just those who could afford the best representation. When the ceremony ended, Judge Sullivan pulled me aside. "You've come a long way from the young attorney who used to second-guess every argument," she said. "Thank you, Your Honor, for everything." She shook her head. "You did the work, Maya. I just made sure the playing field was level. That's all any of us can do." As I left the courthouse that day, I ran into Rachel Martinez, who was now in her final year of law school and working part-time at our firm. She'd turned out to be exactly what we'd hoped: brilliant and dedicated and on fire with the kind of righteous anger that made for excellent advocacy. She told me about a case she was helping research, another developer cutting corners in low-income neighborhoods. "We're going to get them," she said with certainty, "just like you did." I smiled. "I have no doubt." That evening, I returned to my apartment and found a letter that had been slipped under my door. The handwriting was familiar. I opened it standing in my kitchen, the city lights twinkling outside my windows. "Maya," it began, "I don't expect you to respond to this. I'm not even sure you'll read it. But I needed to write it anyway. I've spent the last 2 years in therapy trying to understand how I became the kind of person who could try to have his own sister killed. How I convinced myself that business was more important than family, than human life. The therapist says I'm a narcissist. That I was raised to believe my success was the only thing that mattered, and that anyone who threatened that success was an enemy to be eliminated. I don't know if that's an explanation or an excuse. Maybe both. Maybe neither. What I do know is that you deserved better. You deserved a brother who celebrated your achievements instead of feeling threatened by them. You deserved a family who showed up when you needed them. You deserved to be safe and protected, not targeted and abandoned. I can't give you any of those things now. The time for that has passed. But I wanted you to know that I understand what I took from you. And I'm sorry. Not because I want forgiveness or reconciliation. I know I don't deserve either. But because you deserve to hear it. You were right about everything. In court. In your victim statement. In every accusation you made. I was a monster in an expensive suit. And you were the only one brave enough to call me on it. I hope you're happy, Maya. I hope you've built the life you wanted. And I hope you never think of me again, because you've earned the peace of letting go. Derek. I read the letter twice, then set it on the counter. I didn't feel the surge of emotion I might have expected. No tears, no anger, no satisfaction. Just a quiet acknowledgement that he'd finally seen what I'd known all along. That the person he'd become was someone worth standing against. I didn't respond to the letter. Didn't need to. He was right that forgiveness wasn't on the table, but not because I was holding a grudge. Simply because forgiveness implied a relationship worth salvaging, and we'd never really had one. He'd been my brother in name only, and that was a truth we both had to live with. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window, watching the city breathe and pulse with life. Somewhere out there, families were struggling. People were being dismissed and marginalized. Injustices were happening that needed someone to shine a light on them. And tomorrow I'd wake up and get back to work. Because that's what I did now. Not for vindication or revenge or to prove anything to anyone. But because the work mattered. Because I'd learned that the best response to being underestimated wasn't anger. It was excellence. The best response to being dismissed wasn't bitterness. It was building something they couldn't ignore. And the best response to being left alone in the darkness wasn't despair. It was becoming the light. 3 years after the verdict, our firm had grown to 15 attorneys. We'd won major cases against polluters, slumlords, and corrupt officials. We'd changed policy. We'd protected communities. We'd given. voice to people who'd been told they didn't matter. And every single day, I walked into that office grateful for the second chance I'd fought so hard to create. I never saw my family again after Derek's sentencing. My mother stopped trying to visit. My father sent a Christmas card the first year, then nothing. Vanessa divorced Derek while he was in prison and moved to New York. They all moved on with their lives and I moved on with mine. The difference was that my life had purpose beyond wealth and status. It had meaning that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or social standing. I'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to me, that accident in Coma and abandonment, and transformed it into fuel for something greater than revenge. I transformed it into justice. And that, I realized as I sat in my apartment that night, was the real victory. Not the verdict. Not the money. Not even seeing Derek in prison. The victory was that I'd survived their attempt to erase me and become someone impossible to ignore. Someone who mattered not because of my last name or my family connections, but because of the work I did and the people I fought for. I was Maya Chen. Not Derek's sister. Not my parents' disappointing daughter. Just Maya. And that was enough. That was everything. The years that followed brought a rhythm I'd never experienced before. Not the chaotic urgency of building a case or the adrenaline of courtroom battles, but something steadier. Something that felt like actual living rather than just surviving. I woke up each morning in my Pearl District loft without the weight of proving myself to anyone. The sunrise over Mount Hood became a daily meditation. A reminder that the world continued turning regardless of who acknowledged my existence. Dr. Okoye retired from active practice when he turned 67, though he maintained an office at the firm and came in twice a week to mentor the younger attorneys. We'd sit in the conference room with whoever needed guidance, and he'd share the wisdom he'd accumulated over 4 decades of fighting institutional power. He never took credit for my success, always deflected when people called him my mentor. You would have found your way regardless, he'd say. I just happened to be there when you needed a hand up. But we both knew that wasn't entirely true. There were moments during my recovery when I would have given up if not for his steady presence. Moments when the gap between who I'd been and who I was becoming felt insurmountable. He'd been the one to show me that transformation wasn't about returning to a previous version of yourself. It was about building something new from the wreckage. Rachel Martinez passed the bar exam on her first attempt and joined our firm full-time. She reminded me so much of myself at that age, hungry and determined and carrying the weight of everyone who'd been told they didn't matter. We worked together on a case involving a chemical plant that had been dumping waste into a predominantly Latino neighborhood for 15 years. The company thought they could outlast us, that we'd eventually run out of resources or patience. They were wrong. Rachel was relentless in her research, finding obscure regulatory violations and building connections between the contamination and a cluster of rare cancers in children under 10. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The jury awarded $80 million in damages. When the verdict was read, Rachel broke down crying at the plaintiff table. Later, in the quiet of the office, she told me why. My little brother died of leukemia when I was 12, she said. We lived 3 blocks from a factory that everyone knew was poisonous. But nobody with power cared because we were just immigrants. We didn't speak English well enough to complain effectively. Her voice cracked. Every case we win, I think about him. About all the kids like him who didn't get justice. I put my hand on her shoulder. Now you're making sure others do. That's how we honor them. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Thank you for showing me this was possible. For proving that people like us can win. The firm's reputation grew beyond Portland. We started getting calls from communities across the Pacific Northwest. A tribe in Washington fighting an oil pipeline through sacred land. Farm workers in California exposed to pesticides their employers swore were safe. A public housing complex in Seattle with black mold so severe that children were developing chronic respiratory conditions. We couldn't take every case, but we built a network. Connected people with other attorneys who shared our values. Created a kind of underground railroad for legal services. Passing families from one trusted advocate to another, until everyone found representation. I spoke at law schools sometimes, invited to share my story with students considering careers in public interest law. I always told them the same thing. This work will break your heart regularly. You'll see injustice you can't fix. You'll lose cases you should win. You'll watch people suffer while those responsible face no consequences. But occasionally, not often but enough to matter, you'll win. You'll stand in a courtroom and watch a jury tell a corporation that profit doesn't justify poisoning communities. You'll see families get the resources they need to rebuild their lives. You'll change laws that protect thousands of people you'll never meet. And in those moments, you'll understand why we do this. 4 years after the Chun development verdict, I received an unexpected call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Miss Chun? This is Caroline." The voice was hesitant, uncertain if I'd remember. It took me a moment to place it, then the memory surfaced. Caroline, the nurse from Mercy General. The one who'd sat with me during those early terrifying weeks after I woke from the coma. "Caroline," I said, warmth flooding through me. "How are you?" "I'm good. I'm actually calling because I'm not at Mercy anymore. I left nursing about a year ago." "I'm sorry to hear that. You were wonderful at it." She laughed softly. "Thank you. But I left to go to law school. I'm finishing my first year at University of Oregon." I felt a smile spread across my face. "That's incredible. What made you decide to do that?" "You did," she said simply. "After you left the hospital, I followed your case in the news. Watched you fight your own family. Watched you win. And I realized I'd spent 15 years caring for people after they'd been hurt, but I wanted to stop them from being hurt in the first place. I wanted to fight the systems that create the injuries, not just treat the symptoms." We talked for nearly an hour. She told me about struggling with contracts and civil procedure, about being older than most of her classmates, about wondering if she'd made the right choice leaving a stable career. I told her what I told all the young attorneys who doubted themselves. The fact that you're questioning whether you're good enough means you care about doing it. Right. That's the most important qualification. Before we hung up, she said something that stayed with me. "When you were in that hospital bed, barely able to speak or move, you had this look in your eyes. Like you were already planning how you'd come back from this." I remember thinking, this woman is going to do something extraordinary. I just didn't know I'd get to watch it happen. "Thank you, Caroline. For everything you did. For seeing me when no one else would." "That's what nurses do," she said. "We see people at their most vulnerable and we choose to believe in their resilience. You just happened to prove me right." After that call, I sat in my office thinking about the ripples. How surviving had inspired someone to change careers. How winning had given other people permission to fight. How my refusal to disappear had created space for others to be visible. The 5th anniversary of the verdict approached, and a local journalist requested an interview for a retrospective piece on the case's impact. I normally declined media requests, preferring to let the work speak for itself. But Dr. Okoye convinced me this one was worth doing. "People need to know that justice is possible," he said. "That standing up to power can actually work." The interview took place at a coffee shop near our office. The journalist, a woman named Keisha who'd covered the original trial, arrived with a recording device and a notebook filled with questions. "We've seen significant changes in how environmental violations are prosecuted since your case," she began. "Developers are doing more thorough remediation. Regulators are more aggressive in enforcement. Do you feel like the verdict achieved what you wanted?" I considered the question. The verdict held one company accountable for specific harms. But the real impact has been cultural. People in communities that get overlooked now know they have legal recourse. Developers know they can't assume silence equals consent. That shift in expectations, that's what creates lasting change. She asked about my family. Whether we'd reconciled. Whether I had regrets about how public the case became. "I've learned that reconciliation isn't always possible or even desirable," I said. "Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is accept that certain relationships are fundamentally broken and move forward without them. As for regrets, no. Those families deserved their day in court. My personal discomfort with publicity was irrelevant compared to their need for justice." "What about Derek? Have you had any contact with him since his sentencing?" "None," I said. "And I don't expect to. We're strangers who happen to share DNA. That's all we've ever really been." She scribbled notes then looked up. "There's something I've always wondered. During the trial you were so composed, so controlled, but you were suing your own brother, proving he tried to have you killed. How did you manage that emotionally?" I thought about the question, tried to articulate something I'd never quite put into words before. I think when you survive something that should have destroyed you, you gain a different perspective. The accident, the coma, the abandonment, those things could have broken me. Should have, maybe. But instead they burned away everything that wasn't essential. All the desperate need for approval. All the hope that my family would suddenly become who I needed them to be. What remained was clarity. About who I was. About what mattered. And once you have that clarity, other people's opinions stop having power over you. The article ran a week later with the headline, "From Coma to Courtroom: How Maya Chen Transformed Tragedy into Justice." It included interviews with some of the plaintiff families, quotes from legal experts about the case's precedent-setting impact, and a sidebar about the increase in environmental enforcement actions since the verdict. Mrs. Dawson was featured prominently, talking about her grandson Elijah, who was now 11 and thriving in a new school, after they'd moved to a different neighborhood with the settlement money. He still struggles with focus sometimes, she said in the article. The lead poisoning left permanent effects. But he's getting the support he needs now. And he knows that what happened to him mattered. That people fought for him. That makes a difference in how he sees himself and his place in the world. Reading that, I felt something shift inside me. This was why the work mattered. Not because of verdicts or dollar amounts, but because of 11-year-old boys who knew their suffering hadn't been invisible. Who understood that justice, however imperfect, was possible. 6 years after the verdict, I was invited to speak at a national conference on environmental law. The keynote address in front of hundreds of attorneys, judges, and advocates from across the country. I almost declined. Public speaking to that scale still made me uncomfortable, despite years of courtroom experience. But Dr. Okoye convinced me to accept. Your story needs to be told, he said. Not for your sake, but for all the people sitting in those audience seats wondering if they have what it takes to challenge power. Show them it's possible. I prepared for weeks. Wrote and rewrote the speech. Practiced in front of the mirror, in front of Dr. Okoye, in front of Rachel and the other attorneys at the firm. The day of the conference, I stood backstage in a convention center in Chicago, listening to the moderator introduce me. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. I'd learned over the years that nervousness and excitement felt identical in the body. The only difference was the story you told yourself about the sensation. I walked onto the stage to applause and stood behind the podium. Looked out at hundreds of faces. People who dedicated their careers to fighting for communities that powerful interests wanted to ignore. 7 years ago, I began. I woke up from an 8-month coma to discover that my family hadn't visited me once. Not one time in 243 days. I could see people leaning forward, already hooked by the opening. It would have been easy to let that define me. To let their rejection become the story of my life. To internalize the message that I didn't matter. But I had a choice. I could accept their assessment of my worth, or I could build my own. I talked about the accident. About learning to walk again while studying legal briefs. About Dr. Okoye's mentorship. About discovering that my brother's company had poisoned families who couldn't fight back. And about deciding that the best response to being underestimated wasn't anger, it was excellence. The audience was silent, completely focused. The case I built wasn't just about environmental violations, I continued. It was about accountability. About proving that wealth and family connections don't put you above the law. About showing communities that their voices matter, even when powerful people try to silence them. I described the trial, the moment, when my family realized I was the lead attorney, the verdict, the impact it had created. But then I shifted the focus. Here's what I want you to understand, I said. My story isn't special because I won. It's important because it demonstrates something we all need to remember. Every person in this room has faced moments when the odds seemed insurmountable. When opposing counsel had more resources, more experience, more institutional support. When clients looked to you with desperate hope that you weren't sure you could fulfill. When judges seemed skeptical that your case had merit. We've all been there. I paused, making eye contact with people throughout the audience. What separates the cases we win from the cases we lose often isn't the quality of our legal arguments. It's whether we have the courage to keep fighting when everything suggests we should give up. It's whether we can help our clients believe that justice is possible, even when the system seems designed to deny it. And it's whether we remember that we're not just filing motions and arguing precedent. We're standing between vulnerable people and forces that would erase them. The speech continued for another 20 minutes. I talked about the importance of mentorship, the need to create pipelines for diverse attorneys to enter public interest law, the responsibility we all had to use our privileges and platforms to amplify marginalized voices. When I finished, the standing ovation lasted nearly 3 minutes. People approached me afterward, some with tears in their eyes. A young Black woman told me she'd been considering leaving environmental law for corporate practice because she was drowning in student debt. Your speech reminded me why I went to law school in the first place, she said. I'm going to stick it out. An older white man, probably in his 60s, told me he'd been practicing for 30 years and had started to feel cynical. You made me remember what it felt like to be young and believe we could change things, he said. Thank you for that. But the interaction that meant the most came from a woman about my age, who waited until everyone else had left. She approached hesitantly, clutching a conference program. I'm not a lawyer, she said. I'm a social worker. I snuck into this session because I saw your name on the program and I had to hear you speak. Why, I asked gently. Because I was one of the kids in those condos, she said. Her voice shook slightly. Not the Chun development ones. Different project, different city. But same story. Contaminated land, sick children, families with no power to fight back. I was 7 when we moved in. By the time I was 9, I had developmental delays and chronic health problems. We were too poor to sue, too overwhelmed to organize. So nothing ever happened to the people responsible. I felt my chest tighten. I'm so sorry. She shook her head. Don't be sorry. Be proud. Because when I heard about your case, about how you fought your own family to protect people like me, it changed something. I was 25 and still angry about what had happened. Still bitter that no one had cared enough to stop it. But your case showed me that some people do care. That justice is possible even if it comes too late for some of us. She wiped her eyes. I became a social worker because of you. Because I wanted to help kids like I was. And every time I start to feel discouraged, I remember that you turned your family's betrayal into protection for strangers. If you can do that, I can keep showing up for the families I serve. We talked for another half hour. She told me about her work with foster children, many of whom had been removed from homes due to environmental health hazards. She told me about the systemic barriers she fought daily. And she told me that knowing someone had won against those systems gave her hope when nothing else did. After she left, I sat alone in the empty conference room for a while. Thought about the ways our actions ripple outward in directions we never anticipate. I'd filed that lawsuit to hold my brother accountable and protect specific families. But it had inspired a social worker in another state to keep fighting for vulnerable children. Had given a young attorney permission to stay in public interest law. Had shown communities across the country that challenging power was possible. Those ripples mattered more than any verdict. 7 years after the trial, I took my first real vacation since the accident. Dr. Okoye insisted, practically forcing me to block off 2 weeks on my calendar. You're no good to anyone if you burn out, he said. Go somewhere beautiful. Rest. Remember that you're a human being, not just a legal machine. I chose Hawaii. Rented a small cottage on the north shore of Oahu where the sound of waves replaced the constant hum of the city. I brought 3 books, all fiction, none of them related to law. I spent my days swimming in water so clear I could see my shadow on the sand below. Walking on beaches where the only footprints were mine and the occasional bird. Eating fresh fish and reading until the sun set. For the first time in years, possibly in my entire life, I wasn't performing for anyone. Wasn't building toward anything. Wasn't proving my worth or fighting for recognition. I was just existing. Just being. And it felt like the most radical act I'd ever committed. On the 5th day, I was sitting on the beach watching surfers when my phone rang. I'd promised to keep it on for emergencies but had told everyone at the firm not to contact me unless absolutely necessary. It was Rachel. I almost didn't answer, but she wouldn't call without good reason. Maya, she said when I picked up. I'm so sorry to bother you. But something's happened that I think you need to know about. What is it? Your brother, she said carefully. Derek. He died yesterday. I felt nothing at first. Just a strange blankness where I thought emotion should be. How? Prison fight, she said. From what I understand, it was quick. He didn't suffer. There was a pause. Your mother has been trying to reach you. She wants you to come to the funeral. I watched a wave crash against the shore. Watched the white foam spread and then retreat. Felt the sun warm on my skin and the sand cool beneath me. I'm not going to the funeral, I said. Are you sure? Rachel asked gently. This might be your last chance for closure. I've already had my closure, I told her. Years ago in that courtroom, Derek made his choices and I made mine. His death doesn't change anything. We talked for a few more minutes, Rachel making sure I was actually okay, and not just pretending to be. I assured her I was fine, that I'd process this in my own time, that I didn't need to rush back to Portland. After we hung up, I sat on that beach for hours. Thought about the brother I'd never really known. The boy who'd been given every advantage and used them to build an empire on other people's suffering. The man who'd tried to have me killed and then abandoned me when that failed. I felt sad, but not for him. For the relationship we'd never had. For the family that had never existed except in my childhood fantasies. For the wasted potential of what we might have been to each other if different choices had been made. But I didn't cry. Didn't feel the need to rage or mourn or even acknowledge his passing beyond this moment of quiet reflection. He'd been a stranger for most of my life. His death just made that official. I stayed in Hawaii for the remaining 9 days of my vacation. Didn't attend the funeral. Didn't call my mother or send condolences or pretend to a grief I didn't feel. I just let myself be present in my own life, in the beauty of the ocean and the warmth of the sun and the simple pleasure of existing without obligation. When I returned to Portland, there was a package waiting at my apartment. A small box wrapped in brown paper with my mother's handwriting on the label. I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity won. Inside was a photo album I'd never seen before. Old pictures from when I was a child. Me at maybe 3 years old laughing at something off camera. Me at 7, gap-toothed and proud in a soccer uniform. Me at 10 holding a trophy from a spelling bee I'd won. There was a note tucked inside the front cover in my mother's careful script. Maya, I found this when I was packing up the house. I'm selling it, moving to something smaller now that Derek is gone and your father and I have separated. I thought you should have these. I know I failed you as a mother. I know that keeping these photos while treating you the way I did makes me a hypocrite. But I want you to know that I saw you. Not often enough. Not well enough. But I saw you. And in the moments captured in these pictures, I loved you. I just didn't know how to show it in the ways you needed. I'm not asking for forgiveness or reconciliation. I just wanted you to know that you were loved, however imperfectly. That you weren't as invisible as you felt. I hope you've built a good life. I hope you're happy. And I hope someday you can remember the good parts of your childhood. If there were any, without the weight of all the ways we failed you. Mom. I sat on my couch looking through the album. At pictures of a child who'd been happy before she learned she didn't matter. At evidence that there had been moments, however brief, when my family had participated in my life. I felt something crack open in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but a softening. An acknowledgement that people are complicated. That my mother had carried her own wounds and limitations. That loving someone imperfectly is different from not loving them at all, even if the result felt the same to the child receiving it. I put the album on my bookshelf next to my law degree, and the framed photo of the plaintiff families from the Chun development case. Part of my history. Not the defining part, but present nonetheless. And then I went back to work. Because work was where I found meaning. Where I transformed pain into purpose and anger into advocacy. Where I built the family I'd needed out of mentors and colleagues and clients who became friends. 8 years after the verdict, our firm opened a second office in Seattle. Rachel headed it up, bringing with her 2 other attorneys we'd trained and a fierce commitment to serving communities that had been poisoned by corporate greed. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was small. Just staff and a few community leaders who'd partnered with us on cases. But standing there watching Rachel address the crowd, talking about access to justice and accountability, and the importance of legal advocates who understood what it meant to be dismissed and discounted, I felt something like parental pride. Not because she was mine in any real sense, but because I'd been allowed to be part of her journey. To show her that the path was possible, and then watch her walk it with courage and skill that exceeded my own. Dr. Okoye stood beside me, now 70 and officially retired but still showing up for the moments that mattered. You did good, he said quietly as Rachel spoke. She's extraordinary. She was extraordinary before I met her, I said. I just gave her permission to believe it. He smiled. That's what good mentors do. We don't create excellence. We just remove the barriers that keep people from recognizing it in themselves. We stood there listening to Rachel outline the firm's commitment to environmental justice, to fighting for communities that extractive industries wanted to treat as sacrifice zones. She mentioned me by name, called me her inspiration and mentor, and I felt that same discomfort with recognition I'd always carried. But I was learning to accept it, learning that letting people acknowledge your impact wasn't the same as needing their validation. I could be uncomfortable with praise and still allow them to express gratitude. The two things could coexist. 9 years after the verdict, I turned 42. The firm threw me a small party in the conference room, cake and champagne and terrible karaoke that lasted until the building security asked us to keep it down. I looked around at the faces of people who'd become my chosen family. Attorneys who fought alongside me, paralegals who kept everything running, law students learning the craft. And I realized this was what I'd been building toward all along. Not victory in a single case, but a sustainable ecosystem of justice. A place where people who'd been told they didn't matter could find advocates who understood their worth. I thought about the woman I'd been 9 years ago, standing in that hospital room learning to walk while everyone who should have cared looked away. That woman wouldn't recognize the life I lived now. The confidence, the community, the sense of purpose that filled even the difficult days. But she'd be proud. Proud that we'd survived. Proud that we'd transformed abandonment into independence. Proud that we'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to us and used it as fuel to protect others from similar harm. Someone asked me to make a speech, and I stood with my glass of cheap champagne in a conference room that smelled like legal briefs and ambition, raised my glass and said simply, to everyone who was told they didn't matter and decided to prove otherwise. We drank to that. To resilience. To transformation. To the radical act of building yourself into someone impossible to ignore. And in that moment, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and chose to stand beside me anyway, I understood what I'd been searching for my entire life. Not my family's approval. Not vindication in a courtroom. Not even the satisfaction of winning. Just this. Connection. Purpose. The knowledge that my existence created ripples that made the world slightly better than it would have been without me. That was enough. That was everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.